facing a wave of public anger. Iran's regime could be in a fight for its long-term survival, experts say. Analysis: the protests in Iran transcend class or geography, and show no sign of abating. Historians who study Iran, human rights activists, political analysts, U.S. officials and Iranians on the ground all say the protests represent a potentially revolutionary moment, and that Iranian citizens are increasingly ready. Every night in Tehran, when the clock strikes 9, Iranians take to apartment rooftops and windows, and their voices echo across the city. "Death to the dictator!" they shout, along with the slogan that has become the rallying cry of more than a month of protests: woman, life, freedom. "We chant every night from behind the window with the lights off, so we can't get recognized, or shot by the police in the streets below," said one Iranian woman, who spoke on condition of anonymity to protect her safety. The same chants can be heard in daily protests in cities and towns across the country, a tidal wave of public anger that only seems to gain momentum, even in the face of a violent crackdown by heavily armed security and paramilitary forces. Since the protests erupted in mid-September after a 22-year-old woman, Mahsa Amini, died in the custody of the country's morality police for allegedly failing to comply with a law requiring women to cover their hair, Iran's clerical regime has struggled to contain a movement that keeps spreading and growing. Every day seems to bring another humiliation for the regime. From anti-government graffiti to students heckling government officials, to women walking in the street without headscarves to workers putting down their tools, Iran's regime looks increasingly bewildered by events. Historians who study Iran, human rights activists, political analysts, U.S. officials and Iranians on the ground all say the protests represent a potentially revolutionary moment, and that Iranian citizens are increasingly ready to risk their lives for the cause. "It's like a war, the Islamic Republic versus the Iranian people," said the woman from Tehran. She and other Iranians say the helmeted police, flooding the streets, resemble an occupying force, unsure of their position and unable to trust the local population. "There have been major protests before, but the protests this time are different," Iranians say, because the movement transcends class and geography, and the demands are explicitly political, calling for an end to the regime and not reforms or higher wages. "Every protest we've seen before has been limited geographically, or social-economically, or related to a particular grievance," said Hadi Ghemi of the New York-based Center for Human Rights in Iran. The Green Movement protests of 2009 focused on an election that demonstrators believed was rigged and lasted months, but the movement was dominated by mostly educated, more affluent people in Tehran. Protests in 2019 were shaped by economic hardship and the frustrations of the working class, Ghemi said. "This is different. It seems to have touched every Iranian, in every corner of the country," he said. "The protests have no formal leadership or opposition leader, making it difficult for the regime to cut off oxygen to the movement. The protests are often smaller scale than the mass demonstrations of the past in major cities, but they are more numerous and dispersed across rural as well as urban areas. The security forces have to put down constant pockets of defiance in well-organized neighborhoods where the locals know where to hide, and how to outmaneuver the police," human rights groups and Iranians said. The demonstrators have even set up separate medical care for injured protesters, in private homes to try to bypass official clinics, said Rayman Ahmadi, an Iranian-American physician based in the U.S. who is a longtime human rights activist.